The shuttle descended through the docking bay of Keth Oren Station, and Commander Elise Vance pressed her face against the viewport like a child seeing snow for the first time. She had dreamed of the stars since she was 6 years old, lying on her back in a Kansas wheat field while her grandmother pointed out constellations that humans had named thousands of years ago. Now she was here, aboard an ancient space station built by species who had mastered interstellar travel while her ancestors were still figuring out how to make fire. The shuttle's landing gear touched down with a soft thump, and the airlock hissed open. Elise stepped out into a corridor that stretched in both directions, its walls covered in flowing script from a dozen different languages she did not recognize. The air smelled strange, like ozone mixed with something floral, and the gravity felt slightly lighter than Earth standard. A figure waited for her at the end of the corridor. Ambassador Tessic of the Velith stood nearly 7 feet tall, with blue-gray skin that seemed to shimmer under the station's artificial lights. His eyes were large and dark, like pools of ink, and when he smiled, Elise noticed that his teeth were small and perfectly white. "Commander Vance," he said, his voice musical and soft, "on behalf of the Galactic Concord, I welcome humanity to the stars." Elise extended her hand in the traditional human greeting, and Tessic studied it for a moment before gently pressing his palm against hers. "We have much to show you," he continued, "and much to teach you about our ways." The tour began immediately. Tessic led Elise through winding corridors and vast open chambers, explaining the history of Keth Oren Station. As they walked, it had been built 40,000 years ago as a meeting place for the founding species of the Concord, and it had served as the center of galactic diplomacy ever since 12 species now made up the Concord, each one represented by ambassadors who lived and worked aboard the station. The Velith were the diplomats, known for their calm temperament and their gift for languages. The Dravani were engineers and builders, their stone-like skin a testament to their origin on a harsh, volcanic world. The Keseth were warriors who had long ago turned their aggression toward protecting the peaceful, and the Morath were scientists who had mapped more stars than any other species in history. Elise tried to remember all the names and faces, but there were so many. She had studied the files during her 6-month journey from Earth, memorizing everything humanity knew about the Concord and its members. But nothing had prepared her for the reality of standing among beings who had traveled between stars for millennia. "You seem overwhelmed," Tessic observed gently. "I am," Elise admitted, but in a good way. Tessic made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Humans are young," he said, "but the Concord believes you have potential, and that is why you were invited to join us." They continued walking, passing through a marketplace where alien merchants sold goods Elise could not identify, through a garden filled with plants that glowed softly in colors she had no names for, through a library where data crystals containing the knowledge of countless worlds lined shelves that stretched toward a ceiling she could barely see, and then they came to the door. It was larger than any door Elise had seen on the station, made of some dark metal that seemed to absorb the light around it. Warning symbols covered every inch of its surface, written in languages both familiar and strange. And 2 Keseth guards stood on either side with weapons that hummed with barely contained energy. Tessic stopped walking, and Elise noticed that his posture had changed. He seemed tense, almost afraid. "This is the Chamber of the Lock," he said, his musical voice now flat and serious, "and it is forbidden to all." Elise looked at the door, then at the guards, then back at Tessic. "What's inside?" The ambassador hesitated before answering. "The Eternity Lock," he finally said, "a device left behind by the architects, the first species to travel the stars." "The architects," Elise repeated, recognizing the name from her studies. "The precursor race that vanished millions of years ago." "Yes," Tessic confirmed. They built many wonders before they disappeared. But the lock is their greatest and most terrible creation. He gestured toward the door. Every species that has touched it has suffered. And some were destroyed entirely, others went mad. And still others triggered disasters that claimed billions of lives. Elise felt a chill run down her spine. So nobody touches it. Nobody touches it, Tessic agreed. And that is the first and oldest law of the Concord, carved in stone before any of our species achieved spaceflight. He turned to face her directly, his dark eyes searching hers. You must understand, Commander, that this law exists for a reason. And the architects left the lock as a warning, not a gift. Elise nodded. But something about the door drew her attention. She stepped closer, ignoring Tessic's soft sound of concern, and studied the warning symbols more carefully. They were arranged in a pattern, she realized. Not random like she had first assumed. Each symbol connected to the next in a sequence that flowed around the door like a river. And when she traced the pattern with her eyes, she noticed something that made her breath catch in her throat. The symbols were not warnings. They were questions. Each one asked something different, in different languages and different styles. But they all pointed toward the same central theme. Why do you seek? What do you hope to find? Are you brave enough to reach? Elise felt her heart beating faster as the realization washed over her. The architects had not sealed the lock to keep people out. They had sealed it to test those who came seeking entry. She turned back to Tessic, who was watching her with obvious concern. Is something wrong? He asked. Elise smiled and shook her head. No, she said. Nothing is wrong. But in her mind, she was already thinking about the questions carved into that ancient door. And she was already wondering what might happen if someone finally answered them. She kept this thought to herself as Tessic led her away from the forbidden chamber, past the guards with their humming weapons, and back into the bright corridors of the station. There would be time to think about the lock later. For now, she had a job to do, a species to represent, and a galaxy to learn about. But the questions stayed with her, echoing in her mind like a song she could not forget. And she knew that sooner or later she would have to return to that door and find out what lay behind it. The stars had always called to her, and she had never been very good at ignoring their voice. The stagnant stars. 3 weeks passed on Cathoran Station, and Elise learned the rhythms of life among the stars. She woke each morning in her small quarters, ate breakfast in the communal hall where dozens of species gathered to share food and conversation, and spent her days attending meetings and ceremonies designed to introduce humanity to the Concord. She learned the proper way to greet a Kesseth warrior without causing offense, the correct posture to adopt when speaking with Morith scientists, and the complicated dance of words required to negotiate with Velith diplomats. Like Tessic studied the station's history, memorized the names of its leaders, and tried her best to represent Earth with dignity and grace. But the more she learned, the more something began to bother her. It started with small things, details that seemed unimportant at first, but grew larger the more she noticed them. The technology on the station was impressive, far beyond anything humanity had developed. But it was also old. The ships in the docking bay used the same engine designs they had used 3,000 years ago. The communication systems relied on methods that had not changed in millennia even. The weapons carried by the Kesseth guards were identical to those described in historical records dating back countless generations. One afternoon, Elise sat in the station's grand library, surrounded by data crystals containing the accumulated knowledge of 12 species, and she searched for records of recent inventions. She found nothing. The most recent technological advancement listed in the database was a minor improvement to water purification systems, and it had been made over 3,000 years ago. She searched for records of scientific discoveries, and the results were the same. Last major breakthrough in physics had occurred. Before humans learned to write, the last new mathematical theorem had been proven when her ancestors were still living in caves. She searched for records of art and culture, hoping to find some sign of creativity and change. And what she found made her feel cold. Every piece of music composed in the last 5,000 years followed the same 12-tone scale, never deviating, never experimenting. Every painting and sculpture adhered to strict templates that had been established. In the distant past, every story and poem followed patterns that had been approved by committees of elders who believed that innovation was dangerous and tradition was sacred. Elise closed the database and sat in silence, trying to understand what she had discovered. The Galactic Concord was ancient and powerful and peaceful, but it was also frozen, stuck in place like an insect trapped in amber. Beautiful, but utterly lifeless. She needed to understand why. That evening, she found her answer in an unexpected place. She was walking through the engineering section of the station, hoping to learn more about the technology that kept Keth Oren running, when she heard a sound that did not belong. Someone was crying. She followed the sound to a small maintenance bay, where she found a young Dravani sitting alone among scattered tools and broken machine parts. His stone-gray skin was darker than most of his species, almost black, and his 4 eyes were wet with tears that left pale streaks on his face. "Are you all right?" Elise asked softly. The Dravani looked up in surprise, then quickly wiped his face with the back of his hand. "I am fine," he said, his voice rough and deep like gravel scraping against metal. "I apologize for disturbing you." "Human, you did not disturb me," Elise said, sitting down on a nearby crate. "I was just exploring, and I heard you, and I wanted to make sure you were okay." The Dravani studied her for a long moment, then let out a heavy sigh. "My name is Corvith," he said, "and I am an engineer, or at least I was. Corvith gestured at the broken machines around him. "I was assigned to repair this equipment," he explained. "And while I was working, I noticed a way to improve the design. A small change that would make the engines more efficient." He paused, and Elise saw fresh tears forming in his eyes. "I made the mistake of suggesting it to my supervisor." Elise felt her stomach tighten. "What happened?" "I was removed from my position," Corvith said, "and I was told that innovation is not permitted, that the old designs work well enough, and that anyone who questions them is a threat to stability." He looked down at his hands, his 4 eyes blinking in a pattern that Elise had learned to recognize as deep sadness. "My grandmother made the same mistake many years ago, and she suggested a modification to a shield generator that would have made it more powerful. And she was exiled for her crime." "Crime?" Elise repeated, her voice sharp with disbelief. "Trying to make something better is a crime?" "It is here," Corvith said quietly, "and it has been for as long as anyone can remember." Elise stood up and began pacing the small maintenance bay, her mind racing with questions. "But why?" she demanded. "Why would anyone want to stop progress?" Corvith looked at her with something like wonder in his alien eyes. "You really do not know, do you?" He glanced around as if checking for listeners, then leaned closer and lowered his voice. "The Concord maintains peace through control," he whispered. "And for thousands of years, any species that tried to change things was punished." "Punished how?" "Accidents," Corvith said, the word heavy with meaning. "Plagues that appeared from nowhere, disasters that struck without warning, leaders who died in their sleep." He shook his head slowly. "The Concord teaches that innovation is dangerous, that the old ways are safe, that anyone who reaches too far will be burned." Elise stopped pacing and stared at him. "And everyone just accepts this?" "Everyone was taught to accept it," Corvith said. "Every species learned the lesson eventually, some through pain and some through fear. But we all learned." He paused, and when he spoke again, His voice was barely a whisper. We all learned to stop reaching. Elise thought about what he had said as she walked back to her quarters that night. She thought about the frozen technology, and the empty art, and the perfect, lifeless order that the Concord maintained, and she thought about the questions carved into the door of the forbidden chamber. The questions that asked why someone would seek, why someone would reach, why someone would dare. Humanity had never learned the lesson that the Concord taught humans had always reached, always pushed, always asked questions that made others uncomfortable. They had burned themselves countless times, made terrible mistakes, caused suffering and chaos and destruction. But they had also built wonders, discovered truths, and spread across their planet and into the stars. Maybe that was why the architects had left the lock. Maybe they were waiting for someone who had never learned to stop reaching. Maybe they were waiting for a species exactly like humanity. The question answered, the alarms began screaming at midnight. Elise woke from a dreamless sleep to find her quarters bathed in red emergency lighting, and a voice was broadcasting in a dozen languages, warning everyone aboard Kath Oran's station that something terrible had happened. She dressed quickly and ran into the corridor, where crowds of panicked aliens were rushing toward the central hub. She grabbed a passing Velith by the arm and shouted over the noise, "What is happening?" The Velith's dark eyes were wide with terror. "A rift," she gasped. "A spatial rift has opened near the station, and it is pulling ships into the void." Elise let go of her arm and started running toward the command center. She pushed through crowds of frightened beings, ignoring the protests and the chaos, until she reached the massive chamber where the station's leaders had gathered. Seen before her was pure horror. A vast window dominated one wall of the command center, and through it Elise could see the rift. It was a wound in space itself, a tear in the fabric of reality that pulsed with colors that hurt to look at. And it was growing larger with every passing second. Ships were being pulled toward it like leaves caught in a whirlpool, their engines burning at maximum power as they tried to escape. But one by one, they were swallowed by the hungry darkness. Elise watched a Dravani cargo vessel disappear into the rift, followed by 2 Kesseth patrol ships, and then a Morath science vessel that broke apart as it crossed the threshold. Hundreds of lives, thousands of lives, gone in moments. The Concord's leaders stood before their control consoles, arguing and shouting and accomplishing nothing. "We must evacuate the station," demanded a Kesseth commander, his voice thundering across the chamber. "Evacuation is impossible," countered a Morath scientist, her tentacles writhing with anxiety. "The rift's gravitational pull would destroy any ship that tried to leave." "Then we seal the bulkheads and wait," suggested an elderly Velith. "The rift will close eventually, as they always have." "When was the last time a rift appeared?" The Kesseth demanded. Silence fell over the chamber. The Morath scientist checked her data console, and when she looked up, her face had gone pale. 10,000 years ago," she said quietly. "And the records from that event were sealed because they were too disturbing to share." More ships were being pulled into the rift now, and the station itself was beginning to shake as the gravitational forces grew stronger. Elise felt the floor vibrating beneath her feet, and she heard the groaning of metal as the ancient structure strained against forces it was never designed to withstand. She looked around the command center, searching for any sign of hope, and found none. The Concord's leaders were paralyzed, trapped by their own traditions, unable to act because their ancient protocols offered no guidance for a situation they had convinced themselves would never happen again. And then Elise noticed something that made her blood run cold. The rift was pulsing in pattern. She recognized it was the same pattern as the eternity lock. She had spent hours studying that pattern, tracing the questions carved into the forbidden store. And she knew it as well as she knew her own heartbeat. The rift and the lock were connected. She did not know how or why, But she was certain that the answer to this crisis lay behind that ancient door. Elise turned and ran. She sprinted through corridors filled with screaming aliens and flashing emergency lights, dodging fallen debris and leaping over obstacles, until she reached the chamber of the lock. The Kesith guards were gone, probably called away to help with the evacuation efforts. And the massive door stood undefended. Detsick was there. The Velith ambassador stood before the door, his blue-gray skin pale with fear, his musical voice cracking as he called her name. Commander Vance. Stop. Elise did not stop. She walked toward the door, her eyes fixed on the symbols that covered its surface, reading the questions they asked one final time. Please do not touch that, Tessic pleaded. Stepping into her path, every species that has tried has been destroyed, and I cannot let you do this. The rift is connected to the lock, Elise said, her voice calm despite the chaos around them. I can see it in the pattern, and if we do not do something, everyone on this station will die. You do not know that, Tessic insisted. You do not understand what you are dealing with. Neither do you, Elise replied, because nobody has ever dared to find out. She stepped around him and placed her hand on the door. It was warm, almost hot, and she felt something pulse against her palm like a heartbeat. The door began to open. Tessic made a sound of pure terror, but Elise ignored him and walked into the chamber beyond. It was smaller than she expected, a circular room with walls that glowed with soft white light, and at its center sat the Eternity Lock. The lock was a crystal, roughly the size of her head, suspended in the air without any visible support. It pulsed with the same rhythm as the rift outside, slow and steady and ancient, and as Elise approached, she felt something brush against her mind like a whisper. The questions were louder here, not carved into stone but spoken directly into her thoughts. Why do you reach? What do you hope to find? Are you brave enough to answer? Elise stood before the lock, the fate of thousands resting on her shoulders, and she thought about everything she had learned since arriving on Keth Oren Station. She thought about the frozen technology and the empty art and the fear that had kept entire civilizations from ever trying anything new. She thought about Corvith and his grandmother, punished for daring to imagine something better. She thought about the rift that was tearing ships apart outside, and the leaders who could not save them because they had forgotten how to act without permission. And she thought about humanity, young and foolish and brave, always reaching even when they were told to stop. Tessic appeared in the doorway behind her, his voice raw with desperation. Please, he begged. The architects left this as a warning, not a gift. And if you touch it, you will doom us all. Elise turned to face him, and she smiled. What if they left it as a door? She asked. What if they were waiting for someone brave enough to knock? Before he could answer, she reached out and pressed her palm against the crystal. The lock did not kill her. Instead, it spoke. Why do you reach? And Elise, with the weight of worlds on her heart, gave the only answer she knew, because someone has to. What the architects left behind light exploded through Elise's mind like a sunrise after 1,000 years of darkness. She felt herself falling, floating, flying through a space that was not space, a void filled with colors and sounds and sensations that no human had ever experienced before. And then the voices came. They were not one voice, but millions, speaking in harmony like a choir that had practiced for eternity. And they welcomed her with warmth and wonder and something that felt almost like joy. We have waited so long. They said so very long for someone to answer. Elise tried to speak, but her voice was gone, lost somewhere in the infinite space between her body and her mind. She felt herself being examined, analyzed, understood down to the smallest cell of her being. And she should have been afraid, but she was not. The voices were kind. Who are you? She thought, pushing the question outward with all her strength. We are the architects. They replied, we are the first to reach for the stars. And we are the last to leave them behind. Images flooded her consciousness. Memories that were not her own but felt as real as anything she had ever experienced. She saw a world orbiting a young sun, and she saw the creatures who had evolved there. Beings of light and shadow who had looked up at the night sky and wondered what lay beyond. She saw them build ships and travel between worlds, making discoveries that changed everything they thought they knew about the universe. She saw them grow in knowledge and power, becoming something more than they had been, something that transcended the flesh and bone that had once defined them. And she saw them face a terrible choice. Their children, the species that came after them, were not ready for the knowledge the architects had gained. They fought over it, destroyed themselves with it, used it to cause pain and suffering on scales that defied comprehension. The architects watched their children tear each other apart, and they knew that they had failed. They could not give their knowledge freely, but they could not destroy it either, so they created the locket was a test. They explained, a filter to separate those who sought power from those who sought understanding. Every species that touched the lock was asked a simple question, and the way they answered determined what happened. Next, those who sought the lock because they wanted power received punishment. Those who sought it because they were afraid received madness. Those who sought it because they were told not to received only silence. But those who sought it because they wanted to help, because they believed that reaching was right even when it was dangerous, because they understood that someone had to be the first to open the door, those beings received the truth. You answered correctly, the voices said, and now you will understand. More images flooded Elise's mind. But these were not memories of the past. They were blueprints, schematics, instructions for technologies that made the Concorde's achievements look like children playing with toys. She saw engines that could cross galaxies in moments, shields that could withstand the death of stars, medical devices that could cure any disease and heal any wound. She saw weapons too, terrible weapons that could unmake planets and shatter the fabric of space itself. And she understood why the architects had hidden this knowledge behind the lock. This power could save everything or destroy everything, and it all depended on who held it. The architects had been waiting for someone who would use it wisely. Why me? Elise asked. Why now? Because your species is young, the voices replied. Young and foolish and brave. You have not learned to fear the unknown. You have not learned to obey without question. You still believe that reaching is worth the risk, and because the rift was our final test. Elise felt a shock of understanding surge through her. The rift, she realized, was not a natural disaster. It was part of the lock's design. A crisis meant to force action, to separate those who would act from those who would freeze. The Concorde's leaders had failed the test by doing nothing. Elise had passed by doing something. Now it is time. The voices said, time to share what we have learned. Time to wake the children who have slept for so long. Elise felt the knowledge settle into her mind like water filling an empty vessel. And then she felt something else, something that was not meant for her alone. The lock was broadcasting every ship in the galaxy, every station, every world with the technology to receive, was now connected to the lock signal. They were all hearing what she had heard, seeing what she had seen, learning what she had learned. The test is over, the voices announced, and their words echoed across the stars. You are ready. Elise opened her eyes. She was lying on the floor of the chamber, the crystal floating above her, its light fading to a soft glow. Tessic knelt beside her, his blue-gray face streaked with tears, his dark eyes wide with shock and wonder. What happened? He whispered. What did you do? Elise sat up slowly, her body aching from the strain of what she had experienced. I answered a question, she said, and the architects answered back, beyond the chamber walls. She could hear the alarms fading, the chaos subsiding, and she knew without looking that the rift had closed. But that was not the most important change. The most important change was happening across the galaxy. As billions of beings received the architect's message and realized that everything they had believed was wrong, the lock had not been a warning. It had been an invitation. Waiting for someone brave enough to accept, Corvith appeared in the doorway. His stone-gray face transformed by an expression Elise had never seen on a Dravani before. Hope. "They are saying the old laws are broken," he said, his rough voice trembling. "They are saying we are free to build and create and discover again." Elise looked at Tessic, who was still crying, still processing the enormity of what had happened. "I am sorry," she said gently. "I know this is frightening." Tessic shook his head slowly. "I am not frightened," he said, and his voice was filled with something new, something that sounded almost like wonder. "For the first time in my life, I am not frightened at all." He looked at her, and a smile spread across his alien face. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for being brave enough to knock." The ones who reach. The galaxy burned with change in the weeks following Elise's activation of the lock. Chaos spread across every world and station and ship that had received the architect's message. Some species embraced the revelation with joy, throwing off the chains of tradition that had held them for millennia and rushing headlong into a future filled with possibility. The Dravani were the first to change. Their engineers working day and night to build new machines using the knowledge the architects had shared within days. They had developed engines 3 times more efficient than anything the Concorde had ever produced within weeks. They had begun construction on ships that could travel further and faster than anyone had ever dreamed. The young Velith followed, their diplomats questioning the elders who had taught them that safety was more important than progress. Arguments filled the halls of power. Heated debates between those who clung to the old ways and those who demanded something new. Other species were not so quick to adapt. The Kessith warriors saw the change as a threat, a disruption to the order they had sworn to protect, and many of them demanded that Elise be punished for breaking the Concorde's oldest lord. Morath scientists were divided, some celebrating the new knowledge, while others warned that it was too dangerous to use, and on worlds across the galaxy, ordinary beings looked at the sky and wondered if the future would bring salvation or destruction. Elise stood at the center of it all. Neither hero nor villain, but something in between. She spent her days answering questions from curious scientists and angry politicians, explaining what had happened in the chamber and why she had made the choice she spent her nights lying awake in her quarters, wondering if she had done the right thing. The summons came 3 months after the activation. The Concorde's High Assembly, the ruling body that had governed the galaxy for 40,000 years, called Elise to stand before them and answer for her actions. She walked into the great chamber alone, her footsteps echoing on the ancient stone floor. The assembly sat in a semicircle before her, representatives from all 12 species, their faces hard and unreadable. The eldest among them was a Velith named Torith, who had served on the assembly for over 2,000 years. "Commander Elise Vance of Earth," he said, his musical voice cold and formal. "You stand accused of violating the first law of the Concorde, the law that has kept peace for 40,000 years. Elise met his gaze without flinching. "I touched the lock," she said simply. "I answered the question it asked, and I received the answer the architects left behind. You unleashed chaos across the galaxy," Tarth replied. "Ships have been destroyed in accidents caused by untested technology. Riots have broken out on a dozen worlds, and the order we built over millennia is crumbling around us. Order built on fear," Elise said. "Order that punished anyone who dared to think differently. Order that kept entire civilizations frozen in place while the universe changed around them." Murmurs rippled through the chamber, some angry and some approving. A young Kessith warrior stood up, his scaled face twisted with rage. "She should be executed," he declared. "She has destroyed everything we built. She has freed us, counted a Dravani elder, her stone-gray skin almost black with age. For the first time in 3,000 years, my people are building something new. The arguments grew louder, voices overlapping in a dozen languages, until Torith raised his hand for silence. This decision cannot be made lightly, he said. We will hear from one more speaker before we vote. The chamber fell silent as a figure rose from the back of the room. It was Corvith, the young engineer who had wept in the maintenance bay, and he walked to the center of the floor with a dignity that made him seem older than his years. My grandmother was named Marath, he said, his rough voice carrying to every corner of the chamber. She was an engineer, the best of her generation, and she was exiled because she suggested a way to improve a shield generator. He paused, letting his words settle over the assembly. She died in shame, alone on a mining station at the edge of known space. And her last words were a warning to me. Do not reach. Do not question. Do not dream. Corvith looked at Elise, and his 4 eyes were bright with emotion. I spent my whole life following her warning, and I was miserable, and I was afraid, and I was dying inside, even while my body continued to breathe. He turned back to the assembly. This human did not doom us. She woke us up, and for the first time in my life, I am not afraid to imagine a better future. His voice rose, filling the chamber like thunder. My grandmother was right, and this human proved it. And if you punish her for that, then you prove that the Concord deserves to die. Silence followed his words. Heavy and profound Treth looked at the other assembly members, reading their faces, measuring their hearts. We will vote, he said finally. The vote was narrow. So narrow that Elise held her breath until the final tally was announced 7-5. In her favor, she was pardoned, but that was not the end. The assembly debated for 3 more days, arguing about the future of the Concord and humanity's place within it when they emerged. They announced a decision that would change everything. Humanity would be granted a permanent seat on the High Assembly, not as newcomers to be taught, but as catalysts, as reminders of what the galaxy had forgotten. They would be the species who reached even when reaching was dangerous, who questioned even when questions were forbidden, who touched the forbidden store and changed everything. The announcement spread across the galaxy like wildfire, and reactions were mixed. Some celebrated, welcoming humanity as the salvation the Concord needed. Others mourned, convinced that the old ways were better and that change would bring only destruction. Elise did not care about the politics or the arguments or the endless debates. She cared about what came next. 6 months after her pardon, she stood before a viewport on Keth Oren Station, watching the first new exploration fleet in 3,000 years prepare for departure. The ships were beautiful, sleek designs that combined the architect's knowledge with the creativity of a dozen species. Finally free to innovate, they would travel to uncharted space, seeking new worlds and new wonders and new questions to answer. Tessic appeared beside her, his blue-gray skin warm in the light of distant stars. Your species is terrifying, he said softly. You have no idea how much you have changed simply by being yourselves. Elise smiled. We prefer curious. Tessic made the sound that Elise had learned was Velith laughter. Curious, he repeated, tasting the word. Yes, I suppose that is more accurate. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the fleet power up its engines. Do you ever regret it? Tessic asked. Touching the lock, breaking the law, changing everything? Elise thought about the question for a long moment. She thought about the chaos and the suffering and the uncertainty that her actions had caused. She thought about the lives that had been lost and the order that had been destroyed. And then she thought about Corvith, building something new for the first time in his life. She thought about the young Velith diplomats, finally free to question their elders. She thought about the exploration fleet before her, carrying hope into the darkness between stars. "No," she said finally. "Someone had to knock on that door, and I am glad it was me." The fleet's engines roared to life. Brilliant points of light against the infinite black, and then they were gone, racing toward horizons that no one had dared to imagine for 3,000 years. Elise watched them go, and she felt something that she had not felt since she was a child lying in a Kansas wheat field. Looking up at the stars, she felt hope. The universe was vast and strange and dangerous, but it was also beautiful. And it was waiting for those brave enough to reach humanity had always been reaching. And now, finally, they were not alone.